And during 1900, President McKinley began hinting he was considering me for the Supreme Court. I wanted it badly, but I also wanted to please Nellie. I often told her, I depend on you. My life is only existence without you. So I will leave it to you, in whom I owe everything, and I will abide by your decision.
Well, my decision was an easy one, because an exciting job was offered instead. Will was asked to head a new commission to the Philippines to set up a new civil government there.
We had taken over control of the islands from Spain as a result of the Spanish-American War, but I was opposed to the acquisition, and I had no experience in setting up a civilian government. I was thinking of rejecting the offer, but Elihu Root chastised me, writing, "You have had a very fortunate career. While you are only slightly over 40, you have had 8 years on the federal bench, 3 years on the state bench, and 2 years as Solicitor General. These places you have filled well, but they have been places which involve no sacrifice on your part. Here is a field which calls for risk and sacrifice. Your country is confronted with one of the greatest problems in its history, and you, Judge Taft, are asked to take immediate charge of this problem and get a solution for it some 7,000 miles away from home. You are at a parting of the ways. Will you take the easier course, the way of least resistance, with the thought that you had an opportunity to serve your country and declined it because of its possible sacrifice? Or will you take the more courageous course and, risking much, achieve much? This work in the Philippines will give you an invaluable experience in building up a government and in the study of laws needed to govern a people. And such experience cannot but make you a broader and better judge should you be called upon again to serve your country in that capacity." It was a very persuasive argument, but I still wondered what Nellie would think.
Well, I wasn't sure what it meant, but I instantly knew that I did not want to miss out on this big and novel experience. So right away, I began making arrangements to leave.
And I told President McKinley I would accept if doing this task would eventually lead to a judicial appointment. So we set sail on a new adventure with our 3 children, as Charles had been born in 1897.
Well, our first official duty was a visit to Japan, a country with which I fell in love, although I was not allowed to meet the emperor because of some silly rule against women meeting the emperor. I was enchanted by the empress, though. She must have liked me too, because years later, when Will was Secretary of War, she gave me a beautiful tapestry, which I...
Nellie, you must return it. We have a clause in our Constitution which prevents officials from accepting gifts from a foreign government.
Well, you're the official. I'm not.
But you're my wife.
Well, I'm going to keep it. I'm going to ask the president himself if I can, which I did. And he said yes.
Nellie stayed in Japan with the children while I traveled on to the Philippines. I wasn't sure what would greet us. You see, there was still some fighting going on amongst the natives who did not want another imperial power running their country. My mission was to set up a civilian government as quickly as possible. The island had been under the military command of General Arthur MacArthur. My arrival was covered by newspapermen who wired their stories back to the States. I will never forget, one man wrote, "We ought to ship this splendid fellow back home. It is a shame to spoil his illusion that folks around the world are just like the folks he knows in Ohio. He is so innocent and full of trust that he makes me think of pies, hominy, fried chicken, big red apples, and the little red schoolhouse." But these were just the qualities that were needed to assure the Filipinos that the United States had their best interest at heart. I came to love them, and they came to love me. finally, after a house and servants were secured, I sent for Nellie and the children. Civil unrest had died down so much that by July the 4th, 1901, it was time for a civilian government to replace the military one, and I was sworn in as governor of the Philippines.
We moved into the governor's palace, 35 rooms on 20 acres along a picturesque river. Now I would live like a queen with many servants, social events, culture, and interesting people. I traveled extensively throughout the island and became very independent, as Will spent his days with all sorts of legal and government things. As you can see, Will was able to fall asleep anywhere, even in the middle of conversations with people. I called him Sleeping Beauty. Once, while we were in the Philippines, he slept through a typhoon, a full-fledged typhoon. Will, even the chair you were sitting in was shaking. How could you possibly sleep through all of that?
It's just my way. Besides, I knew you could handle it.
Well, life was just grand. Then Theodore Roosevelt, who was now president, brought up that nemesis, the Supreme Court. First in 1902, then in 1903.
Which I turned down because I felt it would be inappropriate at that time to leave the Philippines, as my job was not yet complete. That must give you some indication of how much I loved those islanders. How much they loved me was shown. When word leaked about the appointment offering, they started nonviolent protests and demonstrations to keep me there. But finally, on March the 27th, 1903, Theodore offered me a position,
which I thought was really fitting for my husband, Secretary of War. Now, this would put him in the cabinet and on the right track for the presidency.
It was one that the islanders and I could accept, because oversight of the Philippines fell to the Secretary of War. They would still be under my watchful eye. One reporter wrote as I prepared to leave, "From the beginning, a relationship of affection and confidence existed between this jovial fat man from Cincinnati and the tribes of little brown men. He encouraged them to call on him and Mrs. Taft. He disarmed them by the openness and freedom of talk, and he charmed them by his simplicity. The Filipinos honored Santo Taft with a reverence that amounted almost to adoration." Adoration. Well, I did have that for the Filipinos, but I had it towards Theodore as well, and he towards me. In his letter offering me the position, he put a P.S. "If only there were 3 of you, one for the Supreme Court, one for Secretary of War, and one for Governor of the Philippines."
Now, 4 of you. One for the President of the United States. And it looked as if it might come sooner rather than later. When Theodore won re-election in 1904, he stated that he would not run for a 3rd term. Although I did not trust that statement, by publicly making it, he had put himself at a disadvantage. And I hope that that would work to your advantage.
It was a wonderful working relationship between President Roosevelt, Secretary of State Elihu Root, and me. We were known as the 3 Musketeers. Theodore and Elihu bore the responsibility for decisions. I simply carried them out. I was very happy. And my weight even dropped from over 300 pounds down to a trim 250. And now they'll have to stop joking about my weight. Once in the Philippines, I wired Elihu Root, "Have just taken a horseback ride. I am feeling fine." He wired back, "How's the horse?"